They had been seated in the seclusion of a rocky glen when she suddenly cut short the culmination of an impassioned period by turning upon him the grave loneliness of her gaze. "I do believe what you say, Mr. Rosedale," she said quietly, "and I am ready to marry you whenever you wish." Rosedale, reddening to the roots of his glossy hair, received this announcement with a recoil which carried him to his feet, where he halted in an attitude of almost comic discomfiture. "For I suppose that is what you do wish," she continued in the same quiet tone, "and, though I was unable to consent when you spoke to me in this way before, I am ready, now that I know you so much better, to trust my happiness to your hands." She spoke with the noble directness which she could command, like a large, steady light thrown across the tortuous darkness of the situation. In its inconvenient brightness, Rosedale seemed to waver, as though conscious that every avenue of escape was unpleasantly illuminated. Then he gave a short laugh and drew out a gold cigarette case in which, with plump, jeweled fingers, he groped for a gold-tipped cigarette. Selecting one, he paused to contemplate it a moment before saying, "My dear Miss Lily, I'm sorry if there's been any little misapprehension between us, but you made me feel my suit was so hopeless that I really had no intention of renewing it." Lily's blood tingled with the grossness of the rebuff, but she checked the first leap of her anger and said in a tone of gentle dignity, "I have no one but myself to blame if I gave you the impression that my decision was final." Her wordplay was always too quick for him, and this reply held him in a puzzled silence while she extended her hand and added, with the faintest inflection of sadness in her voice, "Before we bid each other goodbye, I want at least to thank you for having once thought of me as you did." The touch of her hand, the moving softness of her look, thrilled a vulnerable fiber in Rosedale. It was her exquisite inaccessibleness that made it most difficult for him to give her up. "Why do you talk of saying goodbye? Ain't we going to be good friends all the same?" he urged, without releasing her hand. She drew it away. "What is your idea of being good friends?" she returned with a slight smile. "Making love to me without asking me to marry you?" Rosedale laughed with a recovered sense of ease. "Well, that's about the size of it, I suppose. I can't help making love to you, but I don't mean to ask you to marry me as long as I can keep out of it." She continued to smile. "I like your frankness, but I'm afraid our relationship can hardly continue on those terms." She turned away as though to mark that its final term had been reached, and he followed her with a baffled sense of her having, after all, kept the game in her own hands. "Miss Lily," he began impulsively, but she walked on without seeming to hear him. He overtook her in a few quick strides and laid an entreating hand on her arm. "Miss Lily, don't hurry away like that. You're beastly hard on a fellow. But if you don't mind speaking the truth, I don't see why you shouldn't allow me to do the same." She paused a moment, drawing away instinctively from his touch. "I was under the impression," she rejoined, "that you had done so without waiting for my permission." "Well, why shouldn't you hear my reasons for doing it then? We're neither of us such new hands that a little plain speaking is going to hurt us. I'm all broken up on you. There's nothing new in that. I'm more in love with you than I was this time last year, but I've got to face the fact that the situation has changed." She continued to confront him with the same air of ironic composure. "You mean to say that I am not as desirable as a match as you thought me?" "Yes, that's what I do mean," he answered resolutely. "I won't go into what's happened. I don't believe the stories about you. I don't want to believe them. But they're there, and my not believing them ain't going to alter the situation." She flushed, but the extremity of her need checked the retort on her lip. "If they are not true," she said, "doesn't that alter the situation?" He met this with a steady gaze of his small, stock-taking eyes. "I believe it does in novels, but I'm certain it don't in real life. You know that as well as I do. If we're speaking the truth, let's speak the whole truth. Last year I was wild to marry you, and you wouldn't look at me. This year, well, you appear to be willing. Now, what has changed in the interval? Your situation, that's all." "Then you thought you could do better. Now, you think you can," broke from her ironically. "Why, yes, I do. In one way, that is." He stood before her, his hands in his pockets, his chest sturdily expanded under its vivid waistcoat. It's this way, you see. I've had a pretty steady grind of it these last years, working out my social position. Think it's funny I should say that? Why should I mind saying I want to get into society? A man ain't ashamed to say he wants to own a racing stable or a picture gallery. Well, a taste for society is just another kind of hobby. Perhaps I want to get even with some people who cold-shouldered me last year. Put it that way if it sounds better. Anyhow, I want to have the run of the best houses, and I'm getting it too, little by little. But I know the quickest way to queer yourself with the right people is to be seen with the wrong ones, and that's the reason I want to avoid mistakes. Miss Spark continued a silence that might have expressed either mockery or a half-reluctant respect for his candor, and after a pause he went on. There it is, you see. I'm more in love with you than ever, but if I ever married you now, I'd queer myself for good and all, and everything I've worked for all these years would be wasted. She received this with a look from which all tinge of resentment had faded. After the tissue of social falsehoods in which she had so long moved, it was refreshing to step into open daylight of an avowed expediency. I understand you, she said. A year ago I should have been of use to you, and now I should be an encumbrance. And I like you for telling me quite so honestly. She extended her hand with a smile. By George, you're a dead game sport, you are, he exclaimed. And as she began to move, he broke out, Miss Lily, stop. You know I don't believe those stories. I believe they were all got up by a woman who didn't hesitate to sacrifice you to her own convenience. Lily drew away. It was easier to endure his insolence than his commiseration. You were very kind, but I don't think we need to discuss the matter further. I don't want to discuss anything. I just want to put a plain case before you, he persisted. The wonder to me is that you've waited so long to get square with that woman when you've had the power in your hands. She continued silent under the rush of astonishment, and he moved a step closer to ask, why don't you use those letters of hers you bought last year? Lily stood speechless. In the words preceding it, she had conjectured, at most, an allusion to her supposed influence over George Dorset. But now she saw how far short of the mark she had fallen, and the surprise of learning that he had discovered the secret of the letters left her unconscious of the special use to which he was in the act of putting his knowledge.